funny thing about the sky is that it doesn't have any borders, and for 40 years I made a very comfortable living pretending that the ground didn't have them either. My name is Evan, I'm 68 years old, and until 6 months ago I thought I had successfully engineered the perfect exit from a life of checklists and flight paths into a sunset that smelled like salt air and lime. I'm a retired airline captain from Seattle, a man who spent his career calculating fuel burns and weather patterns, only to realize too late that I completely failed to calculate the cost of my own loneliness. I moved down here to Mexico for the peace, for the way the light hits the Pacific at dusk, and because my investments were strong enough that a beach villa wasn't just a dream, it was a managed asset. But sitting here now in the cockpit of a plane that isn't mine, staring at the Arizona dirt, I realized that I didn't retire to a paradise. I retired into a recruitment office for the Cartel, and the woman I thought was my second chance at youth was actually the most efficient recruiter they ever hired. I remember the first time I saw Marcella at the local market, standing behind a mountain of mangoes and dragon fruit with a look of absolute focus that reminded me of a co-pilot prepping for a difficult takeoff. She's 26, which is a dangerous age for a man like me to encounter because it makes you forget that you've already lived 2 of her lifetimes. I started going to her stand every Tuesday and Friday, not because her produce was the best in the square, though it was fresh enough, but because she had this way of tucked-in laughter that made me feel like I wasn't just a retired gringo with a good pension. I'm an analyst by nature, a man of systems. So I told myself I was going there because the prices were better than the supermarkets and I enjoyed the walk from my villa. That was the first lie I told myself. The second lie was believing that a woman that beautiful, that sharp, and that young was interested in hearing stories about Boeing 747s and the rainy streets of Seattle, just because I was a charming storyteller. For 4 months we played this game of slow proximity, where a few extra pesos for a bag of limes bought me 10 minutes of her undivided attention, and I felt like I was winning a prize I hadn't even entered a contest for. When she finally moved into the villa, it felt like the final piece of my retirement puzzle had clicked into place with a satisfying mechanical thud. I had the house, I had the view, I had my private Cessna parked at the local strip for when I felt the itch to see the world from 10,000 feet, and I had her. She was a whirlwind of energy in a house that had started to feel a bit too much like a museum of my past achievements. But then the phone calls started, and the late-night visits from men who didn't look like they belonged in the fruit business began to sour the air. I found her in the kitchen one morning, her face looking older than mine ever had, and the story came out like a pressurized cabin losing oxygen. She didn't just sell fruit, she moved product through her distribution network, and a shipment worth $10 million had vanished on her watch. She didn't just owe them her life, she had inadvertently signed mine over as collateral the moment she stepped through my front door. The transition from a man of status to a man of logistics happened in the span of a single afternoon when they sent me a digital photograph. It wasn't a picture of Marcella or a threat against my villa. It was a high-resolution shot of my daughter back in Washington State, walking her 3-year-old son to the park. There was no caption, no long-winded villainous speech, just the silent realization that my professional skill set was now the only currency that could keep my family breathing. They didn't want my money because even with my successful investments, I didn't have $10 million sitting in a liquid account. They wanted my wings. They needed a pilot who knew how to navigate the silent corridors of the night, someone who could fly a heavy load into the Arizona desert without tripping the silent alarms of a dozen different agencies. I looked at the weight of the crates they brought to my hangar, and I did the math in my head, the same way I had done it 1,000 times before a cross-country flight, and the numbers were screaming at me. With that much weight against a headwind, I would be landing on fumes. I told them it was a suicide mission, and the man holding the phone just smiled and reminded me that everyone dies, but not everyone has to watch their grandson die first. So I flew. I spent 65 minutes of that flight staring at the fuel gauges, watching the needles dip toward the red line while the moonlight turned the landscape below into a silver graveyard. I thought about the irony of my life. A man who had spent 40 years being the most responsible person in the room, now acting as a high-altitude mule for a shadow organization because I fell for a girl at a fruit stand. I landed in the desert with 15 minutes of reserve fuel left, my hands shaking on the yoke as the tires hit the scrubland, guided only by the headlights of 6 waiting trucks. I expected a bullet or a disappearing act, but instead, they handed me an envelope with $750,000 and told me the debt was paid. They even gave me a newer plane, a sleek 5-year-old model to fly back to Mexico, as if this were a business merger instead of a kidnapping. As I sit here writing this in the cockpit of this new machine, watching the sun begin to bleed over the Arizona horizon, I know the truth that I tried to ignore for months. They didn't give me this plane as a reward. They gave it to me as a tool, because they know I can do the impossible. They'll call again and I'll answer, because I'm 68 years old and I've realized that in Mexico, retirement isn't the end of your career. It's just the beginning of the one you can never walk away from. You think you're buying a sunset, but sometimes you're just buying the darkness that comes right after it. The house in Seattle feels like a ghost story now, a collection of rain-slicked memories that belonged to a man who didn't know how lucky he was to be bored. I remember the day I closed on the sale, handing over the keys to a young couple who looked at the place like it was a fortress, a solid foundation for a 30-year plan. I took that equity, every cent of it, and I poured it into the villa in Mexico because I wanted to prove that I could still outrun the clock. I wanted a life that felt like a continuous ascent, never leveling off, never descending into the quiet mundanity of senior centers and golf courses. Marcella was the fuel for that fire, the person who made the villa feel like a home instead of a high-end rental for a lonely expatriate. For those first few months, the kitchen was always full of the smell of roasting peppers and the sound of her humming songs I didn't recognize, and I'd sit on the terrace with a glass of scotch, watching the Pacific and thinking I'd finally beaten the system. I was a retired captain who had landed the perfect life, a man of status who had found a way to stay relevant in the eyes of a woman 40 years his junior. But looking back, the signs of the distribution business were always there, hidden in the mundane details of her fruit stand. I'd see her on her burner phone, her brow furrowed in a way that didn't match the price of papayas, or she'd have visitors at the villa who stayed in the driveway with the engines running. I chose to see it as her being an ambitious young entrepreneur, a woman with the same drive that had once pushed me through flight school. I didn't want to be the suspicious old man, the jealous benefactor who questioned every shadow, so I leaned into the fantasy. I ignored the fact that a 26-year-old girl in a small market town shouldn't have connections that reached across the border into the desert scrub of Arizona. I was so busy being the hero of my own romantic retirement story that I missed the moment the plot shifted from a romance to a heist. By the time she sat me down and told me about the $10 million in lost product, the stolen shipment that had her name on the manifest, I realized that my villa wasn't a sanctuary. It was a warehouse, and I was just the most expensive piece of equipment they hadn't put to work yet. The weight of the debt was something I couldn't even wrap my head around at first, because $10 million isn't a number you pay off with a pension or a diversified portfolio. It's a number that requires a miracle, or a very specific set of skills that the average person doesn't possess. When the men arrived at my hangar, they didn't come with guns drawn or voices raised. They came with folders of data. They knew my flight hours, they knew the tail number of my Cessna, and they knew exactly how much weight that airframe could carry if you stripped out the interior and pushed the limits of the structural integrity. They weren't looking for a partner. They were looking for a high-altitude truck driver who didn't have a record and could fly below the radar of the regional surveillance. Marcella sat in the corner of the hangar, her eyes red from crying. But she didn't look at me. She looked at the floor, and in that moment I knew that her love for me and her debt to them were two different gears in the same machine. I was the only one who could stop the gears from grinding her and my family back in Seattle into dust. The calculations for that flight were the most honest thing I'd done in years. I spent hours in my office with a slide rule and a weather map trying to find a way to make the numbers work. The shipment was an unreal amount of product, as they called it, a weight that pushed the center of gravity to the absolute edge of safety. To carry that much, I had to sacrifice fuel. It was a zero-sum game. Every pound of their cargo was a gallon of gasoline I couldn't take with me. I factored in the wind resistance, the climb rate of a heavily burdened engine, and the terrifying reality that any detour for weather or a mechanical hiccup would mean dropping out of the sky over the mountains. I had exactly 65 minutes of reserve fuel in my best-case scenario, a margin of error so thin it was practically non-existent. I told the men it couldn't be done, and that's when they showed me the picture of my grandson. They didn't have to say a word. I went back to my charts. I found a way to shave another 3 minutes off the flight path, and I prepared to bet my life on the hope that the wind wouldn't change. The flight itself felt like a fever dream, a return to the cockpit that lacked any of the joy of my career. I was alone in the dark, the engine humming a low, stressed vibration that I could feel in my teeth, praying that the weight wouldn't snap a wing spar if I hit turbulence. I wasn't a captain anymore. I was a man waiting for his luck to run out. Every time I looked at the fuel gauge, I saw the faces of my family, and I realized that the $750,000 they handed me in that envelope after I landed was never about the money. It was a hook. It was their way of showing me that I was now part of the family, a man who had proven he could do the impossible and survive. They gave me a newer plane, a sleek machine with better avionics and a faster cruise speed. Not out of generosity, but because they wanted to see what I could carry next time. I'm 68 years old and I'm sitting in a desert in Arizona, staring at a new cockpit and realizing that I've traded my quiet retirement for a life where every flight might be my last, and every phone call is a command I can't ignore. The day I found the photo of my grandson on my bedside table was the day the tropical heat of Mexico turned ice cold in my veins. It wasn't just a threat. It was a professional assessment of my vulnerabilities, delivered with the same clinical precision I used to use when checking the hydraulics on a 747. I spent that entire afternoon sitting on my veranda, looking at Marcella, trying to find the stranger hidden behind the eyes of the woman I had shared my bed with for months. I realized then that I had been a fool, blinded by the ego of a man who wanted to believe he was still in the game. I wasn't the player, I was the cargo. Marcella didn't cry that day, and in a way, that was the most terrifying part. She just moved around the house with a quiet, efficient glassiness, packing a small bag as if she already knew that our life in the villa was a stage set that was being struck down after the final performance. She told me that the shipment wasn't just missing. It had been intercepted by a rival group because of a leak in her distribution chain, and the only way to balance the ledger was for me to provide a service that no one else in their network could handle. They didn't need a thug or a shooter. They needed a veteran pilot who could fly an overloaded bird for a needle's eye midnight. I walked down to my hangar that evening, the smell of aviation fuel and salt air mixing in a way that usually brought me peace. But now it felt like the smell of a prison cell. The men were already there, and they had stripped the interior of my Cessna 182. They had just taken out the back seats. They had ripped out the carpeting, the door panels, and even the co-pilot seat, leaving nothing but a skeleton of aluminum and wires. They began loading these heavy, waterproof crates, and I watched the struts of the landing gear compress further and further until I thought the tires might actually burst against the concrete. I started doing the weight and balance in my head, the mental math that becomes second nature after 40 years in the air, and the numbers were screaming, danger. I told the lead man, a guy who went by the name of Carlos and dressed like a high-end architect, that the plane wouldn't clear the trees at the end of the strip with that much weight. He didn't argue with me. He didn't point a gun. He just held up his phone and showed me a live feed of a park in Seattle. I could see the swings, I could see the ducks in the pond, and I could see my daughter's blue minivan parked at the curb. I stopped talking about the trees. I picked up my flight bag, grabbed my handheld GPS, and started calculating how to lean out the fuel mixture to the point of engine failure just to gain a few extra miles of range. The sun went down, and the reality of what I was about to do settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't a retirement adventure. This was a cold-blooded calculation where the only variables were fuel, weight, and the lives of my family. I had spent my life following every FAA regulation to the letter. A checklist Charlie, who never took a risk that wasn't mitigated by 3 layers of redundancy. Now I was preparing to break every rule in the book, flying an unregistered flight plan, over gross weight, across an international border into a pitch-black desert landing zone. Marcella came to the hangar right before I climbed into the pilot's seat. She touched my hand, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of the girl from the fruit stand, the one who laughed at my stories about the rainy Pacific Northwest. She whispered that she was sorry, that she never meant for it to go this far, and I just pulled my hand away. I didn't have room for forgiveness in the cockpit. I only had room for the mission. I needed to be the cold, analytical captain one last time, because if I let my emotions in, I'd make a mistake. And at this weight, a mistake wouldn't just mean a crash, it would mean the end of everything I had ever built. I taxied out to the end of the dirt strip, the engine straining under the load even at low RPMs. The plane felt sluggish, like it was made of lead instead of light alloy. I checked the winds one last time, praying for a headwind that would give me a little extra lift on the takeoff roll. But the air was dead still. It was just me, the cargo, and the ticking clock of my fuel reserves. I pushed the throttle forward, and the roar of the engine felt like a scream of protest. The runway lights, just a few flickering lanterns held by men I didn't know, blurred past me. The end of the strip was coming up fast, and the nose stayed heavy, refusing to rise. I felt that old familiar knot in my stomach, the one you get when you're V1 and committed, and for a heartbeat I thought this was where it ended, in a ball of fire at the edge of a Mexican jungle. But then the air caught the wings, the ground let go, and I was climbing into a sky that offered no comfort, only the vast empty darkness of the journey ahead. Once I leveled off at 8,000 feet, the world below disappeared into a void of black velvet and broken promises. Up here, away from the heat of the coast and the heavy silence of the hangar, the cockpit became my entire universe. Usually the hum of the engine is a comfort, it's the heartbeat of the machine. But tonight, every vibration felt like a personal insult to the airframe. I looked at my fuel flow indicator and then at my ground speed on the GPS, and a cold, familiar calculation began to run in the back of my mind. I was fighting a subtle, persistent headwind that hadn't been in the forecast. In a commercial jet, you'd just bump up the thrust or request a different altitude. In a Cessna 182 loaded with enough contraband to buy a fleet of Ferraris, you just sit there and watch your reserve time bleed away, minute by agonizing minute. I had 65 minutes of reserve when I left the ground. 30 minutes into the flight, that margin had already dropped to 52. I was flying a math problem, and the solution was looking more and more like a dead stick landing in the middle of nowhere. The moon finally broke through the clouds, casting a ghostly light over the rugged terrain of northern Mexico. It's a beautiful country from the air, but tonight it looked like a jagged jaw waiting to snap shut. I started to think about the people back in Seattle, about my daughter's laugh and the way my grandson smells like grass and laundry detergent after he's been playing outside. I wondered if they'd ever know the truth if I went down tonight. The headlines would call me a disgraced pilot, a mule, who threw away a decorated career for a quick payday in the sun. They wouldn't see the photo on my bedside table, or the way Marcella's fruit stand had been the perfect blind for a man who just wanted to feel alive again. The shame of that realization was heavier than the crates in the back. I had spent my life being a man of integrity, a man who people trusted with their lives every time they buckled their seatbelts. And now I was a ghost, flying a ghost ship, for men who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable component in a supply chain. About 2 hours in, the engine gave a slight, momentary cough, a hiccup in the fuel line that made my heart jump in my throat. I immediately reached for the mixture control, leaning it out even further, dancing on the edge of a cylinder head temperature spike that could melt the engine from the inside out. It's a delicate, terrifying balance. You need the fuel to stay in the air. But if you run the engine too lean to save gas, you risk a catastrophic failure. I was sweating in the cool night air, my eyes darting between the EGT gauge and the fuel totalizer. I felt like a gambler who had bet his family's life on a single hand of poker, and the deck was stacked against me. I looked out the side window at the wingtip, watching it flex slightly in the turbulence, and I realized that I wasn't just flying a plane. I was flying my own coffin, and the only thing keeping the lid open was a few gallons of leaded gasoline and a stubborn refusal to let the cartel win. The border was a line on a screen, a digital boundary that meant absolutely nothing to the wind or the gravity pulling at my wings. Crossing it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like entering a deeper level of the trap. I turned off my transponder and dimmed the cockpit lights until only the faint glow of the instruments remained, making me a shadow among shadows. I was approaching the drop zone in the Arizona desert, a stretch of flat, unforgiving earth where the 6 trucks were supposed to be waiting. I checked the fuel again. 15 minutes. That was it. If the trucks weren't there, or if the lights didn't come on, I didn't have enough gas to circles for a search, and I certainly didn't have enough to find an alternate airfield. I was committed to a landing site I couldn't see, in a plane that was essentially a flying brick. I began my descent, the air whistling over the fuselage as I pulled back the power, the silence of the glide feeling more like a threat than a relief. As I dropped below 2,000 feet, the desert floor rushed up to meet me, a vast expanse of nothingness. I reached for the radio, but there was no one to call. I just stared into the dark, my eyes straining for any sign of life, any break in the gloom. And then, like a miracle or a curse, the lights flickered on. 6 pairs of high beams cutting through the dust, forming a narrow, makeshift runway in the middle of the scrubland. My hands tightened on the yoke. This was the moment of truth, the point where 40 years of experience had to compensate for a night of terrible choices. I lined up the nose, felt the ground effect cushion the heavy airframe for a split second, and then the wheels slammed into the dirt. The plane bucked and swayed as I fought to keep it straight, the dust kicking up around me like a desert storm. When the engine finally sputtered and died just as I came to a stop, I sat there in the sudden ringing silence, realizing that I had survived the flight, only to face the man I had become on the ground. The dust hadn't even settled against the windshield before the doors of the truck swung open and the silence of the desert was replaced by the rhythmic, heavy thud of boots on hard-packed earth. I sat there in the dark cockpit, my hand still frozen on the yoke, feeling the heat radiating off the engine, cowling like a dying breath. My fuel gauge was a dead needle and pinned firmly against the left side of the dial. If I'd spent 3 more minutes fighting the wind, or 1 more mile looking for those lights, I'd be a smudge on a canyon wall right now. I watched in the side mirror as the men began to unload the crates, their movements practiced and silent, tossing $10 million worth of debt from my wings into the beds of the pickups. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody asked if I was okay. In their world, the machine had simply arrived on time, and the logistics had been satisfied. I was just a part that hadn't broken yet. The man I'd met in the hangar, Carlos, stepped up to the strut of the plane and tapped on the glass with a heavy gold ring. When I opened the door, the desert air hit me cold, dry and smelling of sagebrush, a sharp contrast to the humid salt of Mexico I'd left hours ago. He didn't offer a handshake. He handed me a heavy manila envelope and told me the debt was settled. I looked inside and saw the thick stacks of $100 bills, $750,000 in cash, and for a second I felt a sick surge of revulsion. It was the price of my soul, neatly packaged and tax-free. I asked him why. If the debt was paid, he was handing me a fortune. He just looked at me with a smile that never reached his eyes, and told me that talent like mine is hard to find, and even harder to keep. He pointed toward a second aircraft parked 100 yards away, tucked behind the silhouette of a massive saguaro. It was a newer Cessna, a T-2A6 turbo stationaire, white with a deep blue stripe, more power, better avionics, and a much higher useful load. He told me my old plane was staying in the desert, a ghost to be scrubbed of its tail numbers and vanished into the black market, and that the new one was mine to fly back home. That was the moment the last bit of my retirement fantasy crumbled. A gift like that isn't a gesture of goodwill, it's an investment in future services. As I walked toward that new plane, my boots crunching on the Arizona gravel, I realized that I wasn't going back to a villa or a fruit stand. I was going back to a life where I am permanently on call. I climbed into the pilot's seat of the new machine, and the smell of fresh leather and high-end electronics felt like a betrayal. I started the engine, the turbocharged roar much smoother than my old 182, and I looked at the GPS screen glowing with a crisp, high-definition map of the border I'd just crossed. I was a man with a clean slate and a brand new cage. The flight back to Mexico was empty. No cargo, no heavy weight, just me and the hum of a superior engine. I thought about Marcella waiting at the villa, and I wondered how much of her tears in the hangar had been for me, and how much had been for the success of the delivery. I realized that our relationship wasn't built on the unwritten rules of a romantic late-life restart. It was built on the very written rules of a contract I hadn't read until it was too late. I'm 68 years old, and I have more money in my safe now than I ever made in a single year flying for the airlines. I have a faster plane, a beautiful woman, and a view of the Pacific that most men would die for. But as the sun begins to rise over the Mexican coastline, I don't feel like a man who won. I feel like a man who is just waiting for the next photo of his grandson to show up on his phone. I'm Evan, I'm 68, and I've learned that the most dangerous thing you can do in retirement is try to prove you're still useful. Because once the wrong people realize what you're capable of, they never let you stop. I'll land this plane, I'll walk into my villa, and I'll pour a drink while I wait for the phone to ring. And the worst part isn't the fear or the danger. It's the fact that when the engine started up in the desert for just a split second, I felt the thrill of the flight again. They didn't just buy my loyalty. They bought the part of me that still wants to be the man who can do the impossible. If you're looking at a sunset in Mexico and thinking about a fresh start, just remember to look closely at the shadows. Sometimes the bargain you're making isn't for a better life. It's just for a newer plane to carry the weight you can't ever put down.